Captain Vex prided himself on running the smoothest luxury cruise operation in the Andromeda sector. His ship, the Nebula's Dream, was a floating palace of crystal spires and artificial gravity pools, where the galaxy's elite came to forget their troubles. Today's passenger manifest included Ambassador Quill, a pompous Zentaurian whose head tentacles quivered with self-importance, and Engineer Pip, a nervous Vorthan whose forearms never stopped twitching at control panels. Then there was Jake Morrison, human, quiet, the kind of passenger who ordered simple meals and spent most of his time reading in the observation deck while everyone else networked and showed off. "Captain?" Pip's voice cracked over the intercom. "We have a tiny problem with the navigation array." Vex's scales rippled with annoyance. In his experience, Pip's tiny problems had a habit of becoming catastrophic disasters. "Define tiny, engineer." "Well, I may have cross-wired the quantum stabilizers with the coffee machine's heating element, and now our course trajectory is, slightly off." Through the bridge's viewport, Vex watched a massive planet grow larger. Much larger. The kind of larger that suggested they weren't heading past it anymore. "Pip, please tell me we're not about to crash into an uncharted world." "Technically it's chartered, it's just marked as avoid at all costs in the navigation database." Ambassador Quill's tentacles flailed dramatically as he burst onto the bridge. "Captain, I demand to know why my meditation session was interrupted by what felt distinctly like imminent death." Vex checked his instruments. The planet's surface was rushing toward them at a speed that made his stomach drop. "Everyone to crash positions! We're going down!" Jake Morrison appeared in the doorway, perfectly calm, sipping what appeared to be coffee. "Which planet are we crashing on?" "Ket 7, Vex replied, wrestling with the controls. Jake nodded thoughtfully. "Interesting choice." He secured himself in a crash harness without a trace of panic, as if plummeting toward an unknown world was just another Tuesday for him. The ship hit the surface with a screech of tearing metal, and the universe went sideways. When consciousness returned, Vex found himself hanging upside down from his crash harness, listening to the delightful sound of his ship's hull groaning like a dying space whale. Through the cracked viewport, he could see a landscape that looked like someone had asked a committee of sadists to design the perfect vacation destination. The sky was a sickly green color that hurt to look at, and rain was falling upward. Not metaphorically upward, mind you, literally upward. The droplets were also glowing and making small sizzling sounds when they hit the ship's hull. "Is everyone alive?" Vex called out, working to free himself from the harness. "Define alive," came Pip's muffled voice from somewhere in the wreckage. "Because I'm pretty sure my third arm is pointing in a direction that arms weren't designed to point." Ambassador Quill emerged from behind an overturned luxury sofa, his tentacles now a pale shade of panic green. "Captain, I must insist we contact the nearest rescue station immediately. This is absolutely unacceptable." Jake Morrison walked past them, apparently uninjured, and peered out at the hellscape beyond. "Well, this is cozy. Atmospheric composition looks like it's about 60% poison, 30% more poison, and 10% stuff that'll kill you in creative ways." "How can you possibly know that?" Vex demanded, finally freeing himself and dropping ungracefully to what was now the ceiling. "The way the metal's corroding where that rain hit it. Also, those plants over there are definitely carnivorous. See how they're tracking our movement?" Jake pointed to a cluster of what looked like purple flowers with way too many teeth. Pip's forearms were frantically working at a damaged control panel. "Emergency beacon is down, life support is failing, and according to the computer, this planet has a survival rating of certain death, with a subcategory of extremely unpleasant certain death." "This is outrageous!" Quill's tentacles writhed with indignation. "I am a diplomatic representative of the Zentorian Empire. We cannot simply be left to perish on some backwater death world." "Actually," Jake said, still examining their surroundings with disturbing calm, "we're not going to perish. I'm going to build us a shelter." The silence that followed was the kind of silence that occurs when someone suggests something so absurd that reality itself needs a moment to process it. "Build a shelter," Vex repeated slowly. "With what? Our ship is destroyed, we have no tools, and everything outside is actively trying to kill us." Jake shrugged. "I've got 2 hands and a brain. That's more than most people started with." "This is insane," Pip muttered, his arms still twitching nervously. "You can't just build a shelter from nothing on a planet that's basically a death trap." "Watch me," Jake said, and walked toward the breach in the hull, where the upward falling acid rain was creating a lovely light show. What happened next would have been impressive if it weren't so terrifying to watch. Jake Morrison, armed with nothing but the clothes on his back and what appeared to be an unhealthy amount of confidence, began systematically dismantling their crashed spaceship. "What are you doing?" Vex called out, watching Jake tear a panel from the wall with his bare hands. "Making tools," Jake replied, as if this were the most obvious thing in the galaxy. He twisted a piece of metal into a crude hammer, then used it to flatten another piece into something resembling a blade. Basic principle of survival: work with what you have. Pip's forearms were practically vibrating with nervous energy. "That's a tertiary hull stabilizer. You can't just rip it out and turn it into primitive implements." "I can, and I did," Jake said cheerfully, now fashioning what looked like a crude axe from a decorative wall sconce and part of the navigation console. "Your engineering is actually pretty solid, Pip. This metal holds an edge well." Ambassador Quill watched in horror as Jake began harvesting materials from the wreckage like some kind of methodical scavenger. "This is barbaric. Surely there's a more civilized approach to our predicament." "Sure is," Jake agreed, now dragging a large piece of hull plating toward the breach. "We could sit here and complain while the toxic atmosphere slowly kills us, but I figured building a shelter might be slightly more productive." The humans stepped outside into the hellscape, and for a moment Vex was certain they'd just watched their only hope for survival commit elaborate suicide. The air itself seemed to shimmer with malevolent intent, and something in the distance was making a sound like a dying star. Jake, however, seemed completely unbothered. He examined the ground, kicked at some rocks, and nodded to himself as if he'd just found the perfect spot for a weekend picnic. "Foundation first," he called back to them, beginning to arrange pieces of debris in what looked like a random pattern. "Always start with a solid foundation." "He's lost his mind," Quill whispered, his tentacles curling in distress. "The atmospheric pressure alone should be crushing him." "Actually," Pip said, studying Jake's movements with growing fascination, "his construction technique is surprisingly sound. He's creating a framework that distributes weight evenly across multiple stress points." Jake had somehow found a way to interlock the hull fragments like puzzle pieces, creating a base that looked sturdy enough to support whatever he was planning to build on top of it. He worked with the kind of focused efficiency that suggested he'd done this before, which raised several disturbing questions about human recreational activities. "Where did he learn to do this?" Vex asked, mesmerized despite himself. "Probably summer camp," Jake called back, apparently having overheard. He was now weaving together some kind of support structure from damaged conduits and what looked like part of the ship's entertainment system. You know, normal childhood stuff. "Normal childhood stuff?" Quill's voice climbed to a pitch that only small mammals should be able to hear. "Building survival shelters on Deathworlds is normal for human children?" "Well, not Deathworld specifically," Jake admitted, now somehow turning their broken quantum processor into what appeared to be a water collection system. "But camping, hiking, basic survival skills. Most kids learned them before they hit puberty." The shelter was taking shape with alarming speed. Jake had managed to create walls from interlocked hull panels, a roof that actually seemed to be repelling the upward falling acid rain, and what looked like a primitive but functional ventilation system. "This is impossible," Pip muttered, his engineering training warring with the evidence before his eyes. "He's using scrap metal and broken electronics to create a habitable structure on a planet that kills everything." "Not everything," Jake corrected, pausing to examine one of the carnivorous plants that had been creeping closer to their crash site. "These little guys seem to be doing fine. Actually, they're kind of cute in a horrifying, death-dealing sort of way." The plant in question snapped at Jake's hand with teeth that could have doubled as industrial cutting tools. Jake casually flicked it on what might have been its nose, and it retreated with what sounded distinctly like a whimper. "Did he just discipline a carnivorous plant?" Vex asked weakly. "I think he did," Pip replied, all four arms now hanging limp with shock. "And it worked." Jake had been working for roughly 2 hours when Keth 7 decided to remind everyone why it was marked "Avoid at all costs" in the Galactic Navigation database. The first sign of trouble came when the ground started vibrating in a rhythm that suggested something very large and very unhappy was approaching their location. Jake?" Vex called out nervously. "Are you aware that the planet appears to be having seismic activity?" Jake looked up from where he was installing what appeared to be a door made from the ship's emergency airlock. "That's not seismic activity. That's something walking, something big." Ambassador Quill's tentacles immediately began their panic dance. "Walking? What do you mean walking? What could possibly be walking on this forsaken death trap?" The answer came thundering over the nearest ridge, in the form of what could only be described as a cross between a rhinoceros, a bulldozer, and someone's worst nightmare. It stood roughly 12 feet tall, had armor plating that looked like it could stop a photon torpedo, and was sporting more spikes than a medieval torture device convention. "Ooh, wonderful," Jake said with the kind of calm that suggested he was either very brave or very stupid. A local resident. Everyone get behind the shelter. Behind the shelter? Quill shrieked, his voice reaching frequencies that probably violated several noise ordinances. That thing is the size of a small building. Your little fort isn't going to stop it. The creature, which had apparently decided that their crashed ship was either a threat or a particularly interesting snack, began charging directly toward them. The ground shook with each step, and small rocks were literally bouncing into the air from the impact. Jake calmly walked over to a pile of debris and picked up what looked like a jagged piece of the ship's hull. Pip, I need you to create a distraction. Flash some lights, make some noise, anything to draw its attention. Are you insane? Pip's forearms were gesticulating wildly. You want me to attract the attention of that monstrosity? Trust me, Jake said, positioning himself between the creature and the shelter. I've dealt with worse. What could possibly be worse than that? Vex demanded, pointing at the approaching behemoth. Australian wildlife, Jake replied matter-of-factly, then charged directly at the creature with nothing but a piece of scrap metal and what appeared to be a complete lack of self-preservation instincts. What happened next defied several laws of physics and at least 3 principles of common sense. Jake dodged the creature's initial charge by rolling under its massive body, then used his improvised weapon to strike at what seemed to be a vulnerable spot behind its left foreleg. The beast roared with surprise and pain, spinning around to face its tiny attacker. He's actually fighting that thing, Pip whispered in awe, with a piece of metal and absolutely no backup plan. Humans are clearly defective, Quill muttered, though his tentacles had stopped their panic dance and were now watching Jake with what might have been fascination. Jake dodged another charge, this time leaping onto the creature's back and using his makeshift weapon to strike at what appeared to be a nerve cluster near its neck. The beast bucked and thrashed, but Jake held on with a kind of determination that suggested he'd either done this before or was making it up as he went along. This is impossible, Vex said, his scales shifting colors rapidly with stress. That creature weighs at least 3 tons. How is he not dead? Leverage and momentum, Jake called out, still clinging to the beast's back. Also, knowing where to hit. He struck the nerve cluster again, and the creature suddenly went limp, collapsing to the ground in what appeared to be unconsciousness. Jake climbed down from his defeated opponent and casually walked back to the shelter, still carrying his improvised weapon. That should keep it down for a few hours. They're actually pretty docile once you figure out their nervous system. Docile. Quill's voice had reached a pitch that was causing small crystals to form in the air around his head. That thing tried to kill us. No, it was just being territorial, Jake corrected, now returning to work on the shelter as if giant monsters were merely a minor inconvenience. Probably thought we were invading its nesting ground. Can't really blame it. But Keth 7 apparently wasn't finished with them. The unconscious creature had barely settled when the carnivorous plants began moving. Not just the small ones that had been creeping around the crash site, but larger specimens that looked like they could swallow a small spacecraft whole. Oh, come on, Jake said, sounding more annoyed than frightened. Really? We're doing this now? The plants moved with surprising speed, their root systems allowing them to scuttle across the ground like enormous hungry spiders. One of them, roughly the size of a shuttlecraft, made a beeline for Ambassador Quill, who responded by fainting dramatically. Pip, grab Quill and get him inside the shelter, Jake ordered, picking up another piece of debris and fashioning it into what looked like a spear. Vex, I need you to help me create a perimeter. Help you do what? Vex asked, but he was already moving to follow Jake's instructions. Something about the human's confidence was infectious, even in the face of certain death. These things are photosynthetic, Jake explained, using his spear to fend off a plant that was trying to wrap its tendrils around his leg. They need light to survive. If we can create enough shadow around the shelter, they'll move on to easier prey. He began systematically destroying the approaching plants with a combination of tactics that seemed to involve equal parts violence and botany. When one plant tried to grab him, he used its own momentum to flip it over, exposing its vulnerable root system. When another attempted to spray him, with what was obviously some kind of digestive acid, he used a piece of reflective hull plating to redirect the spray back at the plant itself. This is insane, Vex muttered, but he found himself following Jake's lead, using debris to create barriers and shadows around their improvised shelter. This is Tuesdays, Jake corrected, now using what appeared to be part of the ship's communications array to electrocute a particularly persistent plant. You should see what Wednesdays are like. Within 20 minutes they had successfully driven off the carnivorous flora and established a defensive perimeter around their shelter. Jake stood in the middle of it all, barely breathing hard, while the 3 aliens stared at him with a mixture of awe and terror. How? Pip asked simply. How is any of this possible? Jake shrugged, returning to his construction work. Practice, I guess. Plus, growing up on a planet where everything is constantly trying to kill you tends to teach you a few survival tricks. Everything is trying to kill you on your world, Vex asked weakly. Oh yeah, Jake said cheerfully, now installing what looked like a primitive but functional air filtration system. Australia alone has about 47 different species that can kill you just by looking at you wrong. This place is actually pretty tame by comparison. The silence that followed Jake's casual comment about Australia was the kind of silence that occurs when reality fundamentally shifts and everyone needs a moment to recalibrate their understanding of the universe. 47 species, Pip's voice was barely a whisper, that can kill you by looking at you? Well, technically it's more like 48 now, Jake said, putting the finishing touches on what appeared to be a fully functional door with both manual and automatic settings. They discovered a new jellyfish last month that can cause fatal aneurysms through eye contact. Marine biology is exciting stuff. Ambassador Quill, who had recently regained consciousness and was now sitting very still inside the completed shelter, made a sound that might have been a whimper. Your entire planet is like this? Oh no, Jake said reassuringly, then immediately destroyed that reassurance by adding, it's much worse. Australia is considered one of the safer continents. You should see what lives in the deep ocean trenches, or the Amazon rainforest, or pretty much anywhere in Africa. Captain Vex felt his scales go completely pale. Jake, what exactly is Earth classified as in the galactic database? Deathworld Class 12, Jake replied, now testing the shelter's structural integrity by literally throwing rocks at it. Though honestly, I think that rating is a bit conservative. The evaluation committee probably didn't visit during hurricane season. Class 12? Pip's forearms began their nervous twitching again. The scale only goes up to 10. Yeah, they had to expand the classification system after the first survey team visited Earth, Jake explained, apparently satisfied with the shelter's rock-throwing resistance. The original team lasted about 6 hours before they called for emergency extraction. Apparently they landed near a kindergarten playground during recess and were traumatized by watching human children engage in what they described as casual mortal combat disguised as recreational activity. What were the children doing? Quill asked, his tentacles curling with morbid fascination. Playing tag, Jake said, and maybe some dodgeball. The survey team filed a report claiming that human offspring were being trained as warriors through gladiatorial combat. They weren't entirely wrong. Vex looked around at the shelter Jake had built in just a few hours. It was not only structurally sound, but actually comfortable. The air filtration system was working perfectly. The walls were keeping out the acid rain, and there was even a small area that appeared to be designed for food preparation. So when you said you'd built shelters before, Vex began. Boy Scout summer camp, Jake confirmed, though to be fair, the survival badge requirements have gotten easier over the years. When my dad was a kid, they had to build shelters that could withstand direct tornado strikes. Now they just need to be bear-resistant. Bear-resistant? Pip squeaked. Big furry creatures with claws and teeth, Jake explained helpfully. They like to eat campers, mostly during mating season, but really any time they're hungry or bored. They're actually pretty reasonable as far as Earth predators go. As far as Earth predators go? Quill's voice had risen to a pitch that was causing small harmonic vibrations in the shelter's walls. Well, they're not venomous, they don't hunt in packs, and they can't fly, Jake said as if these were the most basic requirements for a reasonable predator. Unlike the really dangerous stuff. The three aliens exchanged glances that contained volumes of unspoken communication. Finally, Vex worked up the courage to ask the question they were all thinking. Jake, how did humans survive long enough to develop civilization on a planet like that? Jake paused in his work, considering the question with the kind of thoughtfulness that suggested he'd never really thought about it before. I guess we just adapted. Natural selection, you know? The ones who couldn't figure out how to avoid being eaten by giant spiders or poisoned by plants didn't reproduce. The ones who could did. Giant spiders? Pip's voice was getting higher with each revelation. Huntsman spiders can get pretty big, Jake said conversationally. Though they're actually not that dangerous. It's the little ones you have to worry about. Funnel web spiders are only about the size of your thumb, but they can kill you in about 15 minutes. 15 minutes? Quill was now making a sound like a deflating balloon. Yeah, but that's if you don't get medical treatment, Jake said reassuringly. With proper anti-venom, you've got maybe 30 minutes before permanent organ damage sets in, plenty of time to get to a hospital. This is insane, Vex muttered. How did your species ever develop space travel? How do you have time for scientific advancement when you're constantly fighting for survival? Well, that's the thing, Jake said, now adding what appeared to be decorative elements to the shelter's exterior. When everything in your environment is trying to kill you, you get really good at problem solving. You have to be creative, adaptable, and quick thinking, or you don't live to see your next birthday. He gestured to the shelter around them. This isn't special human technology. This is just what happens when you give a human some scrap metal in a few hours. We're basically living Swiss Army knives. Swiss Army knives? Pip asked weakly. Multi-tool, Jake explained. Compact, versatile, useful in almost any situation. Every human learns to be one because if you're not adaptable, you're dead. Natural selection in action. The implications of this revelation hung in the air like the toxic atmosphere outside. The three aliens were beginning to understand that they hadn't just crashed with a passenger. They had crashed with a member of a species that had been forged in the fires of constant mortal peril. So when you said you could build a shelter, Vex said slowly, you weren't being overconfident, you were being literal. Pretty much, Jake confirmed. Though I have to admit this planet is presenting some interesting challenges. The upward falling acid rain was a nice touch. And those carnivorous plants had better coordination than I expected. Better coordination than you expected? Quill's tentacles were now tied in knots of anxiety. You've dealt with carnivorous plants before? Venus flytraps are a popular houseplant on Earth, Jake said. Though admittedly, most of them are only big enough to catch insects, not sentient beings. But the principle is the same. Just then, a distant rumble indicated that their unconscious friend from earlier was beginning to wake up. Jake picked up another piece of debris and fashioned it into what looked like a remarkably professional-looking weapon. Right on schedule, he said. They usually stay down for about 4 hours. Don't worry, though. Now that we've established territorial boundaries, it should be more negotiable. Negotiable? Vex asked, wondering if there was any limit to human insanity. Sure, Jake said, stepping outside to greet the awakening beast. Communication is key to any successful relationship. The three aliens watched through the shelter's window as Jake Morrison, human survivor of Deathworld, Class 12, walked calmly toward a creature that could crush him without effort, apparently planning to have a conversation with it. What followed was possibly the most surreal diplomatic negotiation in galactic history. Jake approached the massive creature, which had risen to its full, terrifying height and was pawing the ground with claws that could have doubled as industrial mining equipment. Instead of running or attacking, Jake simply stood there and began making a series of low, rhythmic sounds. Is he singing to it? Pip whispered, all four arms pressed against the window. I think he's establishing dominance through vocal communication, Vex replied, his scales shifting through colors that hadn't been seen since his academy days studying xenobiology. The creature tilted its massive head, listening to Jake's impromptu concert. After a moment, it responded with its own series of vocalizations that sounded like a combination of whale song and industrial machinery having an argument. Oh, good, Jake called back to them. He's not territorial, he's just hungry, and apparently his name is Kevin. Kevin? Quill's tentacles had gone completely limp. The death beast is named Kevin? Well, that's the closest translation, Jake said, now reaching into his pocket and pulling out what appeared to be part of a protein bar. Kevin here is actually a herbivore. He was investigating our crash site because he thought we might have brought some interesting plants with us. Jake tossed the protein bar to Kevin, who caught it with surprising delicacy and began examining it with the kind of careful attention usually reserved for fine art or explosive devices. He likes the artificial strawberry flavoring, Jake announced. Says it reminds him of home. You can understand what it's saying? Vex asked, his brain struggling to process this latest impossibility. Basic pattern recognition, Jake explained. Once you figure out the grammatical structure, most languages follow predictable patterns. Kevin's using a tonal system based on emotional resonance. It's actually quite sophisticated. Kevin made another series of sounds, apparently asking a question. He wants to know if we're planning to stay long, Jake translated. I told him we're just waiting for rescue and then we'll be on our way. He's fine with that, as long as we don't disturb his nesting ground. His nesting ground? Pitt squeaked. Yeah, turns out we landed right next to Kevin's favorite sleeping spot, Jake said. He's been very polite about it, considering. A new sound filled the air, this one decidedly artificial and coming from somewhere above them. Through the toxic atmosphere, the sleek shape of a rescue vessel was descending, its lights cutting through the green haze like beacons of hope. Finally, Quill breathed, his tentacles uncurling with relief. Civilization. The rescue ship landed with practiced efficiency, and within minutes a team of professional rescue workers was approaching their position. Captain Vex recognized the uniform of the Galactic Emergency Response Service, and he'd never been happier to see bureaucratic competence in his life. Captain Vex, the rescue team leader, an efficient-looking Kaldorian named Commander Flux, approached with a scanner in hand. "We received your emergency beacon. Status report?" "4 survivors, minimal injuries thanks to our passenger," Vex replied, gesturing toward Jake, who was currently saying goodbye to Kevin with what appeared to be a complex handshake involving claws and opposable thumbs. Commander Flux looked at the shelter Jake had built, then at the docile Kevin, then back at the shelter. "Sir, did your passenger just construct a fully functional habitat on a Class 12 Deathworld using nothing but crashed debris?" "Among other things," Vex said dryly. "He also defeated the local wildlife, established diplomatic relations with the indigenous fauna, and did it all while maintaining what I can only describe as supernatural calm." "Supernatural calm?" Commander Flux repeated, making notes on his scanner. "He's human," Pip added, as if this explained everything, which Vex was beginning to realize it actually did. Commander Flux's expression shifted from professional interest to something approaching awe. "A human? You had a human passenger?" "Jake Morrison," Jake said, walking over and extending his hand in the traditional human greeting. "Nice to meet you, Commander. Kevin says goodbye, by the way. He's heading home for dinner." Commander Flux stared at Jake's outstretched hand as if it were a sacred relic. "Sir, I'm going to need to file a very detailed report about this rescue. A human surviving on Keth 7 with improvised equipment is going to get attention from some very important people." "Good attention or bad attention?" Jake asked, with the casual curiosity of someone who'd apparently faced down worse things than bureaucratic scrutiny. "The kind of attention that comes with job offers," Commander Flux replied. "The Galactic Emergency Response Service has been looking for someone with your particular skill set for decades." "What kind of job?" Jake asked, now sounding genuinely interested. "Survival consultant," Commander Flux explained. "There are about 47 different species in the galaxy that have trouble with what you might call challenging environments. They tend to panic, make poor decisions, and generally die horribly when faced with any kind of adversity." 47 species. Jake looked thoughtful. "That's a lot of people who need help." "Indeed. The pay is excellent. The benefits include hazard compensation, and you'd be saving lives on a regular basis," Commander Flux continued. "Plus, most of the Deathworlds you'd be consulting on are significantly less dangerous than your homeworld." Jake looked back at the shelter he'd built, then at the 3 aliens who'd gone from passengers to survivors under his care, then at Kevin, who was now wandering off into the toxic sunset with what appeared to be a spring in his step. "You know what?" Jake said, grinning. "That sounds like fun. When do I start?" "Immediately, if you're willing," Commander Flux replied. "We have a situation on Theta Prime involving a species that's been trapped in their own city for 3 years because they're afraid of the rain." "The rain?" Jake asked. "It's slightly acidic," Commander Flux explained. "pH of about 6.2. Jake stared at him. "That's barely acidic at all. That's like lemon juice." "Yes, well, they consider it a catastrophic environmental hazard," Commander Flux said with the weary tone of someone who'd dealt with galactic bureaucracy for too long. "I can work with that," Jake said, then turned to his former fellow passengers. "Guys, it's been real. Try not to crash into any more Deathworlds without me." "Wait," Vex called out as Jake began walking toward the rescue ship. "Are you seriously going to make a career out of this?" "Why not?" Jake replied. "Turns out being human in a galaxy full of people who've never had to worry about survival is a pretty marketable skill. Plus, it beats my old job." "What was your old job?" Pip asked. "Customer service," Jake said, and for the first time since the crash, he looked genuinely disturbed. "Trust me, dealing with alien Deathworlds is going to be a vacation compared to that." As the rescue ship lifted off, carrying Jake Morrison to his new career as the galaxy's first human survival consultant, Captain Vex stood in the doorway of the shelter and watched Kevin disappear into the toxic landscape of Keth 7. "You know," he said to his companions, "I think we just witnessed the beginning of a very interesting chapter in galactic history." "How so?" Quill asked, his tentacles finally returning to their normal color. "Well," Vex said, "we just discovered that the most dangerous species in the galaxy is also the most helpful. And now they're going to be teaching everyone else how to survive." "Is that a good thing or a bad thing?" Pip wondered. Vex considered this question as he watched the rescue ship disappear into the green sky. "I honestly have no idea. But I have a feeling the galaxy is about to become a much more interesting place." And somewhere in the distance, Kevin made